I decided to carry a baby for my brother, and my boyfriend just vanished. But what he did before that made me question everything. Hi, my name is Aaron, I'm 30, and for the last 3 weeks, I've been living in some crazy movie where every scene is a punch to the gut. The story started so stupidly and ordinarily that looking back now I feel like a complete idiot. My brother James and his wife Sarah have been trying to have a baby for 5 years. 5 years of unsuccessful IVF attempts, nerves and tears. I love them both, and seeing Sarah slowly fade from this pain was tough. She'd had 2 late-term miscarriages, and the doctor said her uterus, well, just couldn't cope anymore. It was a verdict. James tried to keep it together, but his eyes were always filled with that dull, hopeless pain. They talked about surrogacy, looked for agencies, but the cost was just astronomical. James has a good job, he's an engineer, but not good enough to just drop a 6-figure sum like that. It all started a month ago. We were sitting at our parents' place for Thanksgiving. It was such an awkward dinner because everyone knew what shouldn't be talked about. Mom tried, she cooked the turkey, Dad made jokes, but the tension hung in the air. After dinner, when James and I were alone in the kitchen, he suddenly dropped it. He was unnaturally calm. He stood there washing a cup and just said, "Aaron, you know how much Sarah and I want this baby. How would you feel about becoming our surrogate mother?" I nearly dropped my cup. To say I was shocked is an understatement. This is James, my older brother. We've always been close, but this was a whole other level of intimacy. "James, are you serious? That's a huge decision. It's my body, my life for a year." I tried to speak quietly so my parents wouldn't hear. He turned to me, and I saw that look he always used when he wanted something. A look that said, "I'm your brother, you can't refuse me." "I know, Aaron. I know. But think about it. It would be our baby with our genes, but safe. Sarah could be close, control everything. We'll pay for everything you need, you won't have to work. We'll give you enough money to buy that apartment you've dreamed of. It would be a fair deal. And you'd make us the happiest family in the world." He talked about money, about the apartment, about our family, but I only heard one thing: pressure. I worked at a small advertising company, barely making ends meet. The apartment was my dream, and he knew it. I felt 2 things fighting within me: the desire to help my brother, whom I love, and the primal fear of what he was proposing. I asked for time to think. I said I needed to talk to David, my boyfriend. David is my rock. We've been together for 4 years, he's smart, calm, we talked about marriage. I knew his reaction would be key. He's a very rational person. That same evening I told David. We were sitting on my sofa, and I tried to sound as calm as possible. I saw him tense up at first, and then his face turned to stone. "Are you kidding? That's insane, Aaron. This isn't just borrowing a sweater, this is carrying a baby. Your body, your hormones, your life for a year, and the psychological toll after the birth when you have to give up that child. It's not a toy, it's a person." He spoke softly, but every word was like a shot. I tried to explain James's position, to tell him how Sarah was suffering, how this was their last chance. I talked about the money, the apartment. "They're buying you, Aaron. Do you understand? They're buying your body to solve their problem, without thinking about what it will do to you. You'll live with this, not them," David said. We talked until 3 in the morning. I was in a panic, he was cold logic. He said this was a decision that would change everything, not just my life but our relationship. He couldn't understand how I could even consider it. I felt us drifting apart with every passing minute. And then he uttered the words that still echo in my head. "If you agree, I'm leaving. I can't be with you while you're carrying your brother's baby. I won't be able to handle it." That was my hook. An ultimatum. A choice between the brother who needed me and the man I loved. I was stuck. I didn't know what to do. I just told James the first needed a little more time to think it all over. That little more time stretched into 2 weeks, during which David became cold, and James became insistent. I knew I had to make a decision, but how? Every door led to disaster. I felt like a pawn in a very cruel game. And then last Friday I found something on his laptop. Something that David, my rational, calm David, had been hiding from me. And it changed my perception of everything he'd been telling me. It wasn't just about worrying for me. It was much, much worse. The silence after I found it was worse than any shouting match. It was the Friday morning after I'd had the massive fight with David about the surrogacy. James had called me again, his voice softer now, almost manipulative, saying Sarah had booked an appointment with a specialist just in case I said yes, pressuring me with logistics. David was at work, supposedly. I needed air. Needed to forget the crushing weight of either disappointing my brother or losing the man I thought was going to marry me. That's when I picked up his laptop, something I rarely do, just to check the weather or something mundane. It wasn't locked, which was the first red flag. David is paranoid about security. I opened a folder labeled simply Tax Docs 2023. Not tax docs. It was full of screenshots, bank statements, and heavily watermarked medical reports. My hands started shaking so badly, I had to lean against the kitchen counter. The reports weren't for Sarah. They were for James. And they weren't about fertility issues. They were about his sperm viability, and the results were devastatingly clear. James had had a vasectomy 3 years ago, post-argument with Sarah about starting a family too soon, and never reversed it. He'd been lying to Sarah, lying to everyone, pretending they were trying the hard way when he'd made the permanent choice himself. My stomach dropped. This wasn't about Sarah's failing uterus. This was about James backing out of a commitment he made to his wife, and then throwing a massive emotional Hail Mary involving me because he couldn't face telling her the truth about the irreversible surgery he secretly had. The entire emotional appeal, the 5 years of pain, the late-term losses, it was all built on a foundation of his unilateral selfish decision 3 years prior. And now he needed me, his sister, to carry the consequence of his secret. I slammed the laptop shut, my breath catching in my throat. The thought of confronting James made me physically ill. If I brought this up, the whole family structure would implode. Sarah would find out he lied about the vasectomy. James would be exposed as a coward who couldn't own his past mistake. Then I looked at David's side of the story. Hidden under the same tax docs folder was a separate encrypted file. It took me 20 minutes to bypass the password. It was the street name of the first apartment we ever rented together. Inside there were emails. Emails between David and a lawyer in a completely different state, dated just 2 weeks before James even brought up the surrogacy idea. The emails were about setting up a prenuptial agreement draft, standard stuff except for the attached clauses. One section was heavily highlighted. Waiver of parental rights in case of third-party pregnancy involving partner's immediate family. David had been preparing for a scenario where I might become pregnant by someone else while we were married, or maybe even before we married, and he wanted to legally protect himself from any responsibility for a child that wasn't genetically his. But the tone was venomous. He mentioned potential contamination of our clean financial slate, and how he wouldn't sacrifice his future on the altar of some desperate family obligation. I sat there, reading his cold, calculated assessment of me potentially being used as an incubator for my brother's genetically compromised child, if they even could conceive naturally, which was doubtful, and realizing my perfect, rational boyfriend had been planning an exit strategy for months, long before James even spoke a word. His ultimatum wasn't born from worry. It was born from a pre-existing plan to bail if I showed even a flicker of misplaced loyalty to my family over him. He wasn't protecting me. He was protecting his pristine future from my family's perceived messiness. The emotional strain was becoming unbearable. I felt dirty, used by both the brother I loved for his manufactured desperation, and the boyfriend I trusted for his preemptive betrayal. 2 weeks passed in this state. I kept the secrets, James's lie about the vasectomy, David's legal maneuvering locked tight. I stopped arguing with David. I just became quiet, efficient. I avoided James's calls, letting the silence build the tension. Every morning I woke up feeling like I was walking on thin ice over a bottomless pit. The deadline for their fertility clinic application loomed, and I hadn't signed anything, but I hadn't said no either. I was paralyzed by the knowledge that either way, I was losing something vital. My family's trust or my relationship's foundation. I kept looking at my reflection, trying to see the strong woman I thought I was. But all I saw was a woman trapped between two powerful, ugly secrets, waiting for the bomb to drop. I knew I couldn't keep this up. I had to choose a path, and the longer I waited, the more David would assume I was leaning toward yes with James, confirming his worst fears about my priorities. I needed to know what David would actually do, and I knew the only way to force his hand was to give him what he feared most. I resolved to call James and tell him I was in. I needed to see David's reaction when I made the choice that supposedly invalidated our relationship. It was a desperate, manipulative move, but I was too deep in the mud to play fair anymore. The thought of carrying that child, even for the money and to save Sarah's marriage, terrified me, but the thought of David walking away because he thought I would agree was oddly more immediate. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over James's contact, steeling myself for the explosion that was coming, whether it came from my brother or my boyfriend. The month was almost up, and the point of no return was staring me in the face. The silence I created by avoiding them both worked perfectly. It turned James into a desperate man and David into a coiled spring. I decided to follow through with my terrible plan from the end of last week. I called James first. I needed to see David's face when I officially signed up for the destruction of my own life. "I'll do it, James. I'll be your surrogate," I heard myself say, my voice flat and foreign, completely devoid of the emotion I was supposed to feel, either joy for him or horror at the demand. On the other end there was a choked sound, like a gasp of pure relief that instantly curdled into something ugly. "Aaron, thank you. Oh my God, thank you. I knew I could count on you." Sarah's crying. She's just sitting here smiling for the first time in months. He sounded triumphant, like he'd won a major lawsuit, not like he was asking his sister to undergo a massive physical and psychological ordeal. He immediately launched into logistics. "We need to meet the fertility specialist next Tuesday, just to start the preliminary workups. I've already called the lawyer. We can draw up the paperwork by the end of the week. This is happening, Aaron. This is really happening." His immediate pivot to legal paperwork and scheduling felt so transactional, so cold, that it almost made me laugh hysterically. He didn't ask how I felt about having a child with his DNA living inside me for 9 months, only how quickly I could clear my calendar. The money, the apartment, it was all being rushed into place, cementing my role as the incubator. The next few days were a blur of appointments and contracts slid across mahogany tables, all while I meticulously avoided looking at David. David finally cornered me in the hallway on Monday evening. He didn't shout. He was worse. He was surgical. "I saw the emails, Aaron," he said, his voice dangerously low. He wasn't referring to the lawyer's file. He was referring to the screenshots of James's medical records that I had accidentally left open on the laptop when I was checking the weather. He knew about the vasectomy. I froze, caught. "You knew," I whispered, realizing he hadn't just been preparing for my potential family mess. He had been actively investigating my brother's family mess. "You were digging into James's medical history? I was looking for proof that this whole request was built on a lie so you wouldn't be stupid enough to agree," he countered, his jaw tight. "And I found it. James is a manipulative fraud who surgically removed his ability to have children and then weaponized your sister-in-law's pain and your loyalty to trap you. I was trying to save you from him." The hypocrisy hit me like a physical blow. He condemns James for a massive, life-altering lie. Yet David himself spent weeks secretly gathering intelligence on my family, violating every boundary of trust we had, all while holding my future hostage with his own ultimatum. "And what about your secrets, David?" I shot back, feeling a dangerous surge of anger finally overriding the fear. "The lawyer? The prenup clauses? You weren't worried about me carrying a child. You were worried about me being an asset with baggage. You had your exit strategy ready before James even asked." His composure finally cracked. His eyes darkened, losing that rational calm I'd always admired. "That was protection, Aaron. Protection from the kind of instability your family breeds. I saw this coming. I saw you falling for their guilt trip. I offered you a clean future, a stable future, and you threw it away for a biological favor to a man who chose this path." He took a step closer and the air crackled. This was the confrontation I'd been dreading and simultaneously seeking. "I told you my boundary. If you agree to this, I walk. I meant it. Today, James is sending the final contract over for you to sign tomorrow morning. So tell me right now, Aaron, are you signing that document and walking down the aisle with a baby growing inside you that isn't yours, making you a pawn for your brother's selfishness? Or are you choosing us? Choosing the life we built? Because if that pen touches that paper tomorrow, I will be gone. No calls, no texts, no second chances. I will be gone by noon." He stared at me, the ultimatum now sharper, clearer. and delivered with the full knowledge that James's request was based on a profound lie. I had the power to destroy my relationship with David or to participate in my brother's deception. The contract sat in my email inbox, a silent, terrifying promise of a child that wasn't mine, hanging over the final hours of my engagement. My entire life was balanced on whether I clicked sign or hit delete. The clock was ticking toward noon, and I had never felt so completely alone with such a devastating choice. The next morning felt like the air before a tornado hits. David's ultimatum echoed in the apartment. Gone by noon. It was 9 a.m. The contract from James was still sitting in my email. A sterile PDF document detailing gestational terms, financial payouts, and medical protocols. A binding agreement for the next 9 months of my biological servitude. I hadn't slept. I paced the floor, looking at the space where David's things would be gone. A cold, terrifying void replacing the comfort of our shared life. My mind was a battlefield. On one side, David, the man who laid out a future, albeit a conditional one, but who also secretly investigated my family and drew up legal barriers against my potential instability. He was demanding I choose him over an action he viewed as a moral failure on my part. On the other side, James and Sarah. Sarah, whose silent suffering I genuinely couldn't bear to perpetuate. And James, whose lie about the vasectomy was despicable, but whose desperation, even manufactured desperation, was rooted in a deep-seated desire to be a father. If I signed, I protected Sarah's marriage and potentially saved my brother from total exposure. But I handed over my body and likely lost David. If I refused, I saved my relationship with David maybe. But I would shatter Sarah's hope, reveal James as a liar, and cause a massive irreparable rift in our parents' eyes. I decided I needed coffee, or maybe a concrete block to stand on. I pulled on jeans and walked down to the small cafe on the corner, needing to be away from the apartment where David's presence felt like a ticking bomb. I sat down, trying to appear normal while my insides were liquid panic. That's when the real twist hit me, the kind of thing you only see in terrible daytime dramas, but this was my life. I opened my email to delete James's contract, feeling a grim sense of relief, when a new email caught my eye. It wasn't from James. It was from the fertility clinic lawyer, the same firm David had been corresponding with coincidentally. The subject line was, urgent. Sarah Miller follow-up consultation required. I clicked it, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't James's case file. It was a detailed summary of Sarah's recent consultations, dated after James supposedly had his vasectomy confirmation. The summary outlined her own history of issues, yes, but the concluding note from the specialist was devastating. Patient Sarah Miller presents with no viable egg quality for successful implantation, regardless of gestational carrier viability. Recommend full review of next steps, as traditional surrogacy is unlikely to result in a child genetically related to patient Miller, even if the carrier is successful. My hands froze over the screen. This was the moment everything inverted. If Sarah couldn't contribute a viable egg, then even if I carried the baby, it wouldn't be her child in the way she conceived of it. It would have to be an egg donor, or James's non-existent genetic contribution. James's lie about the vasectomy suddenly looked less like a selfish cover-up for his infertility, and more like a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion that Sarah was the one with the solvable problem. If Sarah couldn't use her own eggs, James's vasectomy, even if it were true, would be secondary. The whole premise of the surrogacy request, as presented to me, was fraudulent, designed to place the burden on me while obscuring a deeper, potentially more painful truth about Sarah's fertility. Was James trying to protect Sarah from the humiliation of admitting she needed an egg donor? Or was he trying to force me into the picture quickly, before the conversation turned to donors, which would require massive disclosure? I looked at the time, 11:15 a.m. 15 minutes until David walked out the door, armed with the knowledge that I was choosing to become a gestational servant based on a lie I only partially knew. But now I knew a secret so much bigger. One that implicated Sarah's fundamental identity in this process. I had the power to stop this entire charade, not by refusing to carry the child, but by asking the one question that would expose the entire rotten framework of the last month. Whose eggs are we using, Sarah? I stood up, leaving the untouched coffee. The contract in my email suddenly seemed irrelevant. The choice wasn't between David and James anymore. The choice was between maintaining the facade of a perfect family structure built on deceit, or ripping the bandages off everyone, James, Sarah, and David, and facing the scorched earth that remained. I sprinted back to the apartment, knowing that if David was gone when I arrived, I wouldn't chase him. I would be too busy confronting the brother who asked me to sacrifice my life based on a half-truth about a problem that was much deeper than just a problematic uterus. The clock on David's ultimatum was still ticking, but the clock on my family's quiet deceit had just struck 12. I burst through the apartment door at 11:35 a.m. The silence was absolute, heavier than any sound. David's favorite armchair was empty. The shelf where he kept his ridiculously organized collection of foreign coins was bare. The space I had feared seeing was exactly as I pictured. A clean surgical absence. He had left. The weight of my choice, or perhaps the weight of my delay in choosing, crashed down on me, sharp and immediate, far more painful than I anticipated. He didn't even leave a note, just the cold, stark realization that his rational exit plan had been executed precisely on schedule. He chose the clean slate over the complicated mess, just as he'd warned. I stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, feeling the sting of abandonment, the sharp irony that I was now free from his ultimatum, only to realize I had lost the person I loved because of the very situation he couldn't tolerate. Then something snapped. The pain of losing David was immediate, but the festering wound of James's and Sarah's deception was chronic. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to James's house, fueled by a cold, clear anger that burned away the panic. I found them in their pristine, overly decorated living room. James looked pale, clutching a thick folder, the final contract, ready for my signature. Sarah sat next to him, fragile, her eyes red-rimmed, looking like she'd been crying again. "Don't sign anything," I said, my voice carrying an authority I didn't know I possessed. I walked directly to Sarah. "Sarah, I need you to tell me the truth. Forget James for a second. Forget the agreement. Do you have any viable eggs left? Are you going to be able to use your own genetics in this child?" James lunged forward. "Aaron, stop it. That's private. You don't understand the complexity." "I understand the complexity of lies, James." I cut him off, looking straight into Sarah's eyes. "I know about the vasectomy. I know you've been pretending for years. But what I found out today, what I confirmed this morning, is that even if I carry the baby, it won't be yours or hers in the way you told me. The specialist notes confirm, Sarah. You can't contribute. So tell me, James, why am I agreeing to risk my body, my future, and my relationship for a baby that requires a donor anyway? Why not just face that truth first?" The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the sound of reality collapsing. Sarah didn't flinch or deny it. She looked at James, and the trust between them visibly shattered in that instant. Her face went slack, the carefully constructed hope dissolving into pure, humiliating defeat. "He made me promise not to tell you the extent of it," Sarah whispered, not to me, but to the room itself. "He said if you knew we needed a donor and a surrogate, you'd never agree. He needed a simple story. He just needed me to look sad enough for you to say yes. The vasectomy was his secret shame, and the donor issue became mine." James just stared at the floor, the contract slipping from his numb fingers. He didn't deny a word. He just looked defeated, a man trapped by the web of convenient omissions he'd spun over a month. I didn't wait for an apology or an explanation. I didn't yell. I felt a strange, hollow release. I had detonated the bomb. The ensuing wreckage was no longer my responsibility. I walked out, leaving them standing in the ruins of their calculated plan. I drove home, David's absence now feeling permanent and correct, rather than immediate and shocking. I sat in the suddenly too large apartment. The entire episode took less than 30 days. Yet it had carved a decade of disillusionment into me. I thought about David, choosing his financial peace over my vulnerability, and James, choosing deception over true honesty with his wife and sister. We all demanded sacrifice, but we all hid the true cost. David sacrificed trust for security. James sacrificed honesty for desire. And me? I sacrificed my peace, my relationship, and my body's autonomy on the altar of family obligation, only to find out the offering was for a phantom goal. The phone remained silent. No texts from David. No desperate calls from James. Just the echoing question I couldn't shake. If everyone you love demands you make an impossible choice, maybe the real dilemma isn't what you choose, but whether you choose to believe in the people who forced the choice in the first place. I had saved Sarah from a biological impossibility, but in doing so, I had merely traded one kind of emptiness for another. The silence in the apartment was the sound of a future that was finally, terribly, only mine to build brick by painful brick.